So, my presentation is on the second edition of the Principles of Economics by Carl Menger. As you know, the first edition of the Principle was published in 1871. And it was never translated in English till 1950. So, Menger's position in the history of economic ideas was very well known in German language countries, and also in France and in Italy, where there was a French and an Italian translation of the Principles, of the first edition of the Principles. Okay. Menger died in 1922. He retired from his chair at the very beginning of the century. And for 20 years, he spent all this time in order to write the second edition of his Principle, because he was very disappointed, he was a little bit disappointed of the first edition of his Principle. This is written in his notes, okay, that are collected in his archive. His archive is held in Duke University. Okay? He died in 1921. 2 years later, his son, that was a young mathematician, Carl Menger with the K, edited the second edition of his father, Grundsätze or Principle, as you like. Okay? This second edition was never translated in English. Okay? The aim of this paper is to show, mainly to show which are the differences between the first and the second edition of the Grundsätze, of the Principles. And to try to understand, maybe, why this second edition was ignored, and if it is worthy to know the new subject of the second edition. Okay? First of all, which are the news in the first edition, in the second edition of the Grundsätze? The new parts are Chapter 1. Okay. Chapter 1, in which Menger explained what are human needs. Okay, it's a chapter in which Menger dealt with human needs and with social goods, in order to introduce the nature of institutions. This is the first new chapter 1 that was not present in the first edition. Okay? And then there is the new chapter 4. In this new chapter 4, Menger introduced two meanings of the word economic. Okay? These are the new parts of the second edition of the Grundsätze. What's happened in general? Okay, so this new, this second edition was published in German, in Vienna, so in German, in 1923. When Hayek was in London, in 1934, he edited the collected works of Menger in German. So there was a republication of the Opera Omnia, the collected works of Menger in German. Okay, and Hayek decided not to print, not to publish the second edition of Grundsätze. And he wrote in the introduction of these collected works that the second edition of Grundsätze was useless, because there was nothing new, and because the draft material was too fragmentary and too in disorder. Okay? So the second edition of Grundsätze should be set apart. And this is the German the republication of Menger works in German. Okay, many years later, in 1950, finally, for the University of Chicago Press, there was the translation in English by of Menger's collected works. And again, the second edition of Grundsätze was not printed. Okay, and Knight was agreed with the with what Ike wrote many years ago. Okay. Stigler, in 1937, Stigler wrote an article on that was published on the Journal of Political Economy, in which he said, it's the only reference of the second edition of Grundsätze, so in which he said that the second edition of Grundsätze is not worthy, and so there's no need to talk about this second edition, okay? But without giving any further explanation. Okay. The first scholar who wrote about this missing second edition of Grundsätze was Carl, not Michael, the brother, Carl Polanyi in 1971. He was focused mainly on the new chapter 4. Okay. He didn't mention anything about the chapter 1. So this is the story of this second edition of Grundsätze. So let's go inside the subject of this new edition. Chapter 1 and Chapter 4. So Chapter 1 deals with human needs, I told you before, and social goods and institutions. In this Chapter 1, Menger said that human needs are fundamental in order to understand what is economic activity. So the economic activity starts from the knowledge of what is a human need from a biological and psychological point of view. So we have to understand how human needs arise, which is the biological nature of human needs. Why? Because we have to understand which are the causal connection between goods. Because if you remember the starting point of the first edition of the principles, at the very beginning, the first sentence is the law of cause and effect, the Aristotelian law of cause and effect, that the principle that knows no exception. So, in order to understand what is economic activity, we have to understand which is the causal connection between a human need and his satisfaction. This causal connection is a useful thing. This useful thing is a good. This is the first edition. And then, after this principle, there is the list of the prerequisites to define a good. This is well known. A human need, property that renders the thing capable of being brought into causal connection with the satisfaction of this need, human knowledge of this causal connection, and the command of the thing sufficient to direct it to the satisfaction of the need. In the second edition of the Principles, the chapter 1 is no more on economic good, on the nature of goods. The chapter 1 is on human need, because Menger was not satisfied of this list. He wrote, to start with the definition of good with a human need is a problem, because we have to understand what is a human need before. Okay. So, which is a human need? Menger tried to explain that a human need is a biological alteration on psychological impulses. Where is it? Okay. A biological alteration. So, on psychological impulses, and vice versa. So we have a sort of interconnection between a biological response that is also a psychological response to something. That this something is a sort of stimulus by the external environment. But needs can also came from the inner stimulus. So it's a sort of interaction between biological alteration and psychological impulses. Menger stressed the fact that we have to understand the biology of needs, so the biology of how our bodies work, in order to understand how society works. So we have the starting point is the individual, okay? How this individual works in a biological and psychological point of view, and then try to understand if which is the connection between this natural science and the social science. He wrote that the passage from biology to moral science, and economics in particular, is the theory of human needs. The theory of human needs is the passage from biology to economics, to social science in general, and economics in. Well, he used the word moral sciences, because, of course, it's more common. As I told you before, the human needs are biological alteration of the human nature that are provoked by stimuli that can be external and internal. So the fundamental role of the environment in Menger was clear. So there is a fundamental role of the environment, what now you can call it the sort of ecological economics, right? The problem is that it's not just economic activity. Of course, it's not just a biological or psychological activity. It's also a cultural one. So when these human needs arise, what's happened to men, to individuals? What's happened? Why this biological alteration is the passage from? It's a passage to social science, to economics, because this alteration requires a cultural response. So it requires what? The knowledge of goods. If you know which is the good that can satisfy your need, you are making a choice. You are doing an economic activity. So economic activity is, summing up, starts with the human needs that are provoked by impulses, but also impulses provoke new human needs. The means to satisfy needs are goods. Goods can also provoke inner desire that are new human needs. So it's a sort of chain. It's a sort of causal chain, the cause and effect chain, that is very Aristotelian, of course, because Menger never discharged the Aristotelian scheme. Okay? The red part is the biological part of the process. The black part is the cultural process. And the sum of biological process and cultural process is economic activity. And the more complete is the knowledge of physical and psychological nature of human being. So if we know exactly, if we know in which sense our biological alterations are working, we can also understand how our society is working, because it's a consequence. So what about these needs? Because this is a premise. What about these needs? Menger explained us that there are two kinds of needs, real and imaginary. So the same distinction that we have in the first edition on goods. And which is the difference between a real need and an imaginary need? Their feasibility. So a real need is feasible. An imaginary need is not feasible. If a real need is feasible, that need is an object of economic activity. So we are making an economic choice. We are inside the economy. Okay? If an imaginary need is not feasible, it has nothing to do with economic activity. So it's outside of the economic activity. Okay? It's the imaginary need doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Simply that it is not a part of economic activity. These real needs can be material and spiritual, can be physical and psychological, can be immediate or mediate. This is the same distinction of goods in the first edition. So goods of the first order are immediate. Goods of the highest order are mediate. Now the problem is which kind of biology Menger is using. This is the very weak part of the paper, because unfortunately there are no references except for Scheffel. I mean, it could be useful to see Menger's library, for example, in order to check if there are books from Lamarck, from Darwin, from whatever, from some biologists, in order to see if he annotated something, if there are quotation about no. In the printed edition there are no quotation about biologists, but it doesn't mean that biology is not in the text, of course. Well, what I try to understand is that this kind of biology in Menger's that is always related to the Aristotelian pattern of cause and effect, because this is impossible to forget. Menger was an Aristotelian, was a 19th century scholar. So, which kind of biology he used? Well, I don't know. I mean, it seems to be more Lamarckian because of these characteristics. But maybe you can help me. You can suggest me something. Well, why Lamarckian? Because I can see that these characteristics are very Lamarckian. I mean, a biology that the central role of environment in the changes of species are very Lamarckian. The tendency of organisms to become more and more complex in the evolution is Lamarckian, but it's also Darwinian. And also the spontaneous generation of more complex living forms from the simplest one again is Lamarckian. But this is the weakest part of the paper. I mean because it's very, very hard to understand which kind of biology Menger is using, because he's using biology, but which kind of?
It sounds like Spencer.
Yes, so Darwinism.
No, Lamarckian.
Lamarckian.
No,
So
Spencer's a...
there are no references except of Scheffel. Maybe there are some connection between Scheffel and Spencer. I have to check it out, because if this is, so you agree this is Lamarckian, sort of Lamarckian model.
Mediated, I suspect, is Spencer.
Mediated by Spencer.
So Spencer was the last important Lamarckian.
Yes, mediated by Spencer. And what about the German context? I mean, there is a counterpart of Spencer in German countries that could be Scheffel. But I have to check. It will be really very useful to check the library, because in the archive there are so many notes. But I don't know if these notes are related with the edition of principles. I cannot say, well, there is a note on Scheffel, there is a note on Spencer, there is a note on Darwin or Lamarck, and this is the chapter 1, because it's not true. I mean, there are notes. Okay. It seems to be, for me, it's a Lamarckian system. So it's pre-Darwinian, or it's something like that. This biology, this model, this biological model, Menger used this biological pattern, thanks to that he explained the human needs, in order to introduce institutions in the chapter 1. In a new way, he introduced institution talking about social needs, because he was talking about human needs. So human needs are for individuals and human needs are for groups. Okay. So the subject of economic activity can be individuals, but can be also groups. Okay. And groups are social groups. And when we talk about the needs of social groups, we talk about social needs that are different from individual needs, of course. And Menger, talking about social groups, distinguished between two kinds of social groups. A social group that is simply the sum of individuals. And another kind of social groups that is formed by institutions. These institutions, according to Menger, are more than the sum of these individuals. This is very interesting in my opinion, because we are accustomed to consider Menger as a stronghold of subjectivism. There's nothing more than individuals and the sum of individuals in a society. In this second edition, he introduced the institution at the very beginning of the book. In this way, in a contraposition with the idea of a social group just like a sum of individuals. Social groups can be common needs, social needs of social groups can be common needs, collective needs, and needs of human associations. Menger clearly distinguished between these three. A common need is simply the sharing of the same need of people who, by chance, live in the same area. For example, yeah, something like that. So we are living in the same area, there is just this source of water, we can share it. So, and this is a common need. Everybody needs water to drink and to do whatever, and so we can share these common needs, okay? Then we have collective needs. Collective needs are needs shared by individuals who live in the same area, but they need a tool, a shared tool, in order to satisfy these needs. For example, you have children and they have to go to school, and so you need a building for the school. Okay, and so that building is a collective need. Okay, well, the idea. The need that your children have to go to school is a collective need. The building is a collective good. Okay? This is again, the collective need is again a need of a social group that is simply formed by the sum of individuals. But there are groups, social groups, institutions that are more than the sum of individuals. Why? Which is the difference between these two groups? Because when this kind of individuals, of institutions arise, at a certain point, they have new needs that are not connected with individuals. And these new needs are stronger than individual needs. And so, in a certain sense, individuals have to be sacrificed in order to satisfy the new needs of these human associations that are institutions. An example is the state. So when institutions are going more complex and complex and complex and complex, new needs arise, and these new needs are no more simple as the needs of the sum of individuals. And in my opinion, in my opinion, this is sort of this introduction of institutions in such a way can be regarded as a new form of holism in Menger thought. This is, I know that this is a very, very strange sentence, because we are not accustomed to consider Menger as as a supporter of holism. We are accustomed to consider Menger as the founder of the subjectivism in economic theory and of individualism. Why we are accustomed? We are accustomed because we know Menger from Hayek's point of view. And Hayek's point of view, Hayek was the founder of individualism. Yes. And so, and Hayek absolutely, this is another story. In my opinion, this introduction of institution in such a way is a new form of holism in Menger. That means simply that the position of Menger can be regarded in a different way. It doesn't mean that Menger was a historian. It doesn't mean that Menger was no more the founder of subjectivism or individualism. Just that Menger's position in 20 years after, maybe more, in 50 years after the publication of the first edition of his principle, can change his mind in a more balanced position. The second edition, in this second edition, in the first chapter of this second edition, economics agents can be social groups. Social rules and social pressure can influence individual choice, and they are stronger than individuals. The problem with Menger is that we are also accustomed to consider Menger as the founder of individualism, also because of his very famous Methodenstreit against Schmoeller and the Young Historical School. Of course, this is true. Menger was against Schmoeller and the Young Historical School, and the struggle was between individualism versus holism. This is okay, but the struggle was, it was between Menger and Schmoeller. We have not to forget that the influence on Menger from the old historical school are very, 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 very strong. The first edition of the principle was dedicated to Russia, and the link between the old historical school and Scottish Enlightenment we mentioned was very strong. So this idea of institutions, of the spontaneous order of institutions, and also the idea that institutions are more than the sum of individuals, is very old historical Germanic school, but also very close to the Scottish Enlightenment. Maybe it's not by chance that Hayek always stressed the affinities with Menger and Scottish tradition, and never with Menger and German tradition. He always underlined the struggle between Schmoeller and Menger. So the idea that evil against God, this is an exaggeration, of course, but maybe this can be happened. Hayek can have his reasons, and I have an idea about that, but I don't want to talk about Hayek. This is chapter 1. Then we have chapter 4. I'm talking about the new parts of the second edition because it's the subject of the paper. So this is chapter 4. In chapter 4, Menger introduced two meanings of the word economic. The first one he called the techno-economic meaning. That is the subjective aspect of human economy. The choice of scarce ends in a context of given ends. Of scarce means in a context of given ends. So the formal part of economic theory, the Robbins economic choice. What Robbins wrote in his book of 1932. And then another meaning, the objective aspect of human economy that concerns with material condition of human economic activity. And it has to be focused on the safeguard of natural resources of the environment. This is what Menger wrote. So, economic theory, economics in general, the word economic can be used in two ways. There are two different meanings of economic. The subjective one, that is the formalistic, the formal aspect of economic theory. The theory of choice, when there are given ends and scarce means. Okay? And according to the literature, Menger can be regarded as one of the founder of this formal meaning of the economic. Okay? But he has nothing to do with the second meaning. This is the classical meaning. I mean, the meaning of the classical school. Okay? So economics can have also an objective aspect that is focused on the material condition of life, of course. And Menger, at this point, Menger added that the concrete aim of human economy is the allocation of the maximum quantity of goods to satisfy human needs. It's very important to rank the future. It's very important for Menger to be forward-looking. So not to waste resources. This is very modern. This is very, very up to date. And so we have to rank the future. This is a program for a policy. This is not a program. This is not the economic choice, the logical theory of choice. This is a program of policy. So we have to rank the future needs. The institutions have to rank the future needs. We have to know the quantities of goods that are able to satisfy future needs. We have to respect the natural environment in order to avoid any loss of available goods. This is what Menger wrote. We have to avoid waste resources. And then we have, of course, to rank the future needs in order to satisfy the needs that are more important than others. And of course, this cannot be an individual program. This can be regarded as a sort of policy. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
So who is the we? You say we have to rank the future needs.
In my opinion, the subject of this objective meaning is institution. So that kind, this kind of social group. I told you before that Polanyi was the first scholar who noticed this missing second edition of Grundsätze, and he was focused on this difference between the subjective aspect and the objective aspect of human economy. And according to Hayek, to Polanyi, there was a real conspiracy theory against this second edition of Grundsätze that was led by Hayek and then by Knight, because they were very worried about the nature of this new Menger. And they tried to avoid, like devil, this second edition of Grundsätze, because in this second edition of Grundsätze there were too many not so much individualistic points, and so it's better not to translate in English because it's not time. I mean, we need a strong hold of subjectivism. We need a strong hold of individualism. And so there's no need to publish this second edition of all because it's posthumous, and so there is no Menger desire to publish it and something like that. This is Carpolani's opinion. Of course, because Carpolani considered Menger as the founder of the substantivist in anthropology. So this is Carpolani conspiracy theory. In my opinion, well, maybe this is too much. Maybe this is too much. Maybe this is too much also because Menger clearly wrote that, okay, there are two meaning of economics, but the problem was that the classical school stressed too much on the objective aspect, and there's time to also to introduce this subjective aspect. So I'm not meaning that in the second edition of the Grundsätze Menger was rejecting the first one, absolutely. Just that in the second edition it's a sort of more, it's a sort of a broader perspective of what is economic theory, or what is economics. I try to let you know why, in my opinion, the second edition of Grundsätze are worthy, and where are the new parts, and this sort of new interpretation of Menger that is not a new Menger it's not Menger 1 and Menger 2. It's not Menger 2 that rejected Menger 1. It's a more complex Menger that maybe today can be read in another perspective. And I don't know if Hayek really decided not to translate, or not to, republish and then translate the second edition of Grundsätze because he was worried about these new parts. Because I have no proofs. There are no letters between Hayek and Knight, or between Hayek and Karl Menger Jr. in which Hayek wrote, well, this is too dangerous, we can't, okay? But maybe there's no need of proof. I mean, there's no need of a conspiracy theory. Just the history of ideas also happens by chance. I mean, Hayek had the power, it was the heir, the intellectual heir of Menger, and so he decided to do that. And we know Menger, we know just the Menger 1. And Menger 2, as I told you before, is not against Menger 1, just is a broader Menger. And as Menger is fundamental in the history of economic theory, and in the history of ideas, above all of ideas, maybe it is worthy also to know, at least to know, that there is a second edition which is new parts. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much.
Who do you think Menger might have been reading between the sort of first edition and the second edition? I mean, do you think he had some? Do you think he'd have been reading Durkheim or something like that? Do you think is there some way of finding out to sort of gain, greater purpose or more?
So, are you asking me if Menger was read?
No. Who might he have been reading to influence and broaden his perspectives or change?
Oh, you read so many authors. You read, Scottish. You read Marshall, for example. This is very interesting. There are so many notes on Marshall principles. This is interesting because in the paper by Hayek on Menger, Hayek told that Marshall was influenced by Menger. So the principles, Marshall's principles that were published during the 90s are very influenced by Menger. That could be. Okay. In my opinion, it could be also the influence of Marshall on Menger, above all on the biological stuff. Because the principles of Marshall are, in the principle of Marshall, there is a biological model. So the market, economic activities like wood, something like that, and firms are like trees, and so there is this biological paradigm that was very, very common at the end of the 19th century. It was very, very common. And so, and then he read, of course, French authors, Italians, so many Italian authors, and in Italy, he wrote so many, he read, this is a good question, he read so many positivist authors. And of course, in the late positivism of the end of the 19th century, the interconnection between biology and social science was very, very strong, because it's positivism. I mean, and this is why maybe Hayek was so worried, because it was in the 30s and in the 40s, he was struggling against the new positivism in Vienna. So
right, so when you use the word holism, I just think of Durkheim or someone like that.
Holism, for me, holism is not a devilish characteristic. I mean, holism means that there could be a group in which individuals are sacrificed in a certain sense. It doesn't mean I like it, but it happens.
Yeah.
It could happen. And so this is the new kind of holism. We are accustomed to consider holism like, fascism. So the state against the individual. No, not you.
Yeah.
But I mean, we are accustomed to exaggerate, the dichotomy. But maybe the definition have to be more complex, in the sense that there is a sort of interaction between individual and the group, and something like that. And maybe Menger was very, 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 modern, because he anticipated so many issues that are common in these years, above all in economic theory. As you, this is a biological, no, this is a biographical remarks. Do you remember when my first interest on complexity theory? And complexity theory in the history of economic thought. Maybe there are some connection between complexity theory and the Austrian school, in which sense, if complexity theory is how complex systems work, we have a sort of forerunner of complexity theory, maybe, of course, in Hayek, of course, but also in Menger, but in another way. That's it. Thank you.
Related to that question by Chris is how much is his son involved? He was the editor of the second edition.
He was the editor.
So he had he could do something with the second edition, and he must. And what was his reason to publish?
Okay. He was 21 years old when he edited the second edition. He edited after 2 years, but from in 1921, when his father died, he was very ill. He was in a sanatorium for tuberculosis. So he went back to Vienna the year after. So he worked on this second edition during 1922. So why he decided to publish the second edition? Because I think because he wrote in his autobiography that he decided to publish the second edition of Grunsetze because his father was very disappointed by the first edition. He never allowed the republication of the first edition. That's why the first edition was republished in the 30s, because he never allowed the republication of the first edition and the translation of the first edition, except for the translation that were made very soon, like the Italian translation and I'm not sure the French translation. I'm sure about the Italian translation. Okay, then and I think that it's a sort of posthumous gift present to his father. And according about the possibility that the son wrote these things, or the son arranged these things, well, I checked the draft.
There is some, maybe that's what to give a context to this, is the son was very much interested in the Dutch mathematician Brouwer. And Brouwer has
After.
That is
after.
okay, otherwise, because it's mathematics, but the philosophy is very odd.
Strange.
Yes, straight. And so maybe that's its connection, but if that is just after that.
It's after, because he went to Amsterdam during the period in which he edited the second edition of his father's principle. He was a student of Hahn in Vienna, so mathematics. And he, in the same year of the publication of the second edition of Grundsätze, he, the junior, Carl with K, wrote an article on expected utility and the paradox of St. Petersburg that was not printed because he sent this article to the Zeitschrift, and Meyer was the editor. And when Meyer saw this article that was full of mathematics formula, he rejected it. And then it was published when Morgenstern became the director of the Zeitschrift in 1934, so 11 years ago. But he went to Amsterdam in 1925, so later. And he broke with Brouwer in 2 years, so because he was crazy, and so.
He was a genius.
Yeah.
That's the Dutch perspective. I wonder whether this dichotomy between objective and subjective would be better put as a trichotomy between objective, subjective, and intersubjective. And I think, for instance, I was struck when you talked about Menger and collective needs. In that, I was reminded that Antonio de Marco, back in 1883, put out his first public finance book that 40 years later got translated into this big monster book. That in that 1883 book, he talked about collective needs. But go back to it. He talked about collective needs, but then you get to Samuelson and public goods. Samuelson gave a totally objective statement of public goods that resided in the character of the goods. Davide did not do that. He gave a subjective statement of collective needs that were needs that people sensed that arose in a situation of people living together in close proximity. And so it was a kind of an agglomeration of people set in motion at the intersubjective level, a kind of common recognition that led to Davidi's kind of formulation of the phenomenon of public finance arise not only because of Robinson Crusoe on his island, but because of a bunch of them recognizing that they're in this intersubjective sense. And I just wonder whether that might be rather than this objective-subjective dichotomy, whether that kind of trichotomy might fit some of the orientations that Menger had in play. Because he certainly did not locate the value of goods in the objective quality of the goods ever. And I can't believe he'd ever do that.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I liked it very much. I would like, if it's possible, maybe, I don't know, I don't know quite anything about Menger. Yes, I know, but not much. I was very attracted by your short reference to the link between Menger and the Scottish Enlightenment. And maybe it's an acquired, I don't know. I don't know anything about that.
It's a common knowledge. I mean,
it's a common knowledge, yes. And but I would like to have. I looked in your paper, but I didn't find any.
Because there's no written.
Yes, it's not written, and that's why I was because I I thought I will find something interesting and some references, and I didn't find anything.
Right.
But it's a common knowledge.
For Menger's scholars, yes.
Yes.
Because it's about, above all, around the role, the nature of institutions.
Yes.
So the Scottish traditions, well, I'm not an expert of Scottish Enlightenment, but the Scottish
Yes.
Enlightenment, according to the Scottish Enlightenment, institutions arise in a sort of spontaneous way. So this because they are in contrast with the contractualism.
Yes, I know.
And in Menger is almost the same. I mean, there is not there's anything is planned.
Yes.
Can be planned.
Yes, yes.
That's
Yes, I know. But my interest was in knowing that there are, whether it's possible to find precise reference in Menger.
Oh yes, in Menger there are so many. Yes, there are so many. Not so much on Smith, but above all on Ferguson, yes, and Hume. More than Smith. It's quite strange because when I find Smith quoted in Menger, it's always in order to criticize him, because always. And so, but thank you. Yeah, thanks.
I have a brief question, comment on this holistic issue, which is certainly central to your paper. On the way
It's policy.
the holism issue.
Sorry.
On the way to Peter Feinberg's dissertation on holistic sociology.
I don't know.
And yes, but no, I mean it's an attempt to show that you can model social interactions from a perspective of individualism, reducing it to individual conduct, but still saying that the whole can be more than the sum of the. So I'm not sure if this is a contradiction if you say that the whole might be a complex network which is more than the sum of individuals, then that you have to say that is holism. I'm not sure about that, but it was really interesting aspect of your paper. So would you say that this is an automatic conclusion to put such an idea that saying an institution, let's say society as a complex network is more than the individuals, that is holism?
It's not the sort of how is working. It's not that institutions or complex system or this new holism work better than. But they are different and they exist.
Yes, they're different. But if we can attribute their properties to the network, which is based on the individuals, then we could say it is sociological view of the institution from an individualistic point of view, without putting it as holism. I would say holism is if you say that it's something completely new, which has an own life of itself. Mm-hmm. Would you say that? Is this the way you're reading Menger?
I think so.
Then perhaps it could be seen as holism. That's true.
I think so. It seems to me. I'm reading the text. It seems to me.
Thank you. That was very interesting. My question, in the first edition, Menger's got the evolution of some institutions. One being some evolved institution to remove asymmetric information in the market for trading.
Money?
Yeah, right. That was in there.
Yes, money. Computer money.
Oh, yeah, money too. But also some kind of statistical agency in Menger's first book. And I couldn't tell if that was a state institution or a business entity or whatever the statistical agency was in his first book. But then that as an introduction, then you mentioned these evolved institutions. Did he actually mention the word state? You mentioned state.
Menger mentions state.
He does
in the
mention
second
the evolution
edition,
of the
yes.
state.
In the first chapter, when he introduced the human association as institutions that are different from the previous one because they are more than the sum of the individuals. He used these words.
In the capital S or a small S?
I don't remember exactly. Well, I don't, no, maybe in the capital because it's German. But it has to be capital. It has to be capital because it's German. Right? Right.
This goes back to that very interesting question that was raised a while ago about who had Menger read. And you made a very interesting point about his concern with the preservation and sustainability of environmental resources. Almost sounds like he would have had something to say about the deep drilling oil spill. And how but I wonder, had he read Pigou on externalities?
There's no reference of Pigou in Menger archive, but I have no idea if there is a Pigou books in his library, because his library is in Tokyo.
Okay.
So, and there are no articles on Menger's library. There is no the list. There is no the list on the website, for example, on which.
About the economics of welfare.
We don't know, but we don't know. I don't know.
How did it get to Tokyo?
There's an article on it.
Sorry?
There's an article on that somewhere. I can't recall, but why?
It's Yaji.
What's located in Japan?
In Japan is located his library, and in Duke is located his archive. This, but there is no paper on Menger's library. That it seems to be huge because it was sold by his son just after the death of his father, and he kept the archive. And then he gave the granddaughter gave the archive of the father, of the grandfather, and the father of Menger with C and Menger with K 20 years ago at Duke.
So you have to go. Gotta go out and go.
Need a foundation.
Oh, I think this is terrific fun. I mean, the thought of a Hayek night conspiracy is
It's not mine. It's
I
mine.
understand. It is so wonderful. I mean, you know, Murawski wrote that Knight couldn't organize a one-car parade, which is surely right. One thing you might look into is Stigler talked in class about he taught with Carl Menger. And I wonder whether in Stigler's archives there may be notes of the discussion with
It's a good suggestion. Where is the Stigler archive?
Chicago.
Chicago?
Yeah, Chicago. And that you know, presumably the topic of conversation would be the second edition.
Maybe. I checked the correspondence between the son, Menger with the K,
Yeah.
and Hayek.
Yeah.
Nothing about the second edition. This is weird. Because it was published 10 years later, 10 years earlier than the collected works, and there's no letters between Hayek and Carl, and nothing also, nothing between the son. I mean, there are letters, but you know, how are you? Merry Christmas, good to see you, or something like that. But nothing about the second edition of Grunsetze.
That's interesting. That's interesting. On the sort of your questioning of the trajectory, and I think that the second edition may help a good deal with the possibility of the Dawson linkage, because if you have a Robinson, the standard story is that Robinson Crusoe loans came in with Dawson, and it's not right, but let that go. If you've got a Robinson Crusoe model doesn't do very well when new people come in, you get new commodities, and that what you've got in your social groups or social needs is strong superadditivity, and so one of the ways you can get that strong superadditivity is you get new commodities when new people come in, and so that could be a way of saying, that could be a way of dealing with, sort of, is this influenced by Robinson Crusoe modeling? Intuitively, it can't be because it's Aristotelian, right? You need a, man's a political animal and that sort of stuff, so you can't, and that's,
Thank you. So just.
You might have actually said this, but so apologies if you did. But where's this second edition been? I mean, in a sense, was it actually published or not? And I guess
Germany. It is Germany. In Austria.
In Austria, but is there any sort of there must have been commentary and about the differences between the second and the first edition.
There are two reviews, from Bites and from Mises. I cannot find the from Mises review. It was published in 1924. I cannot find it anywhere. I checked when I was in Duke. I know the reference, but I cannot find it. Maybe some German friend of mine, new friend of mine, can help me. I can send you the reference, and please, because I have the review of Bites.
What to do?
But not the review of von Mises. I cannot find. I mean, not me. Duke Library, library staff cannot find it. So maybe somewhere in Germany there is this newspaper. No, it's not a newspaper. I think it was a journal. I have the references. Maybe it's in the paper. I'm quite sure it's in the biography.
It's in Moscow.
Yeah. It's in Moscow, yeah.
Those are Pascal,
Yeah, that's right.
It's not a review by Stalin or Lenin, but it's for me that's quite impressive.
So it was never reprinted.
No.
It was
Never reprinted in German,
Yeah.
because the German edition was a Hayek London School of Economics, and of course never translated in English. But there is so many copies. I mean, I read it.
Sure. You could find it again.
Where?
You could find it again. Even Linkage has worked with this.
No, but the second edition you can find it.
No. It's a nice meta class.
Okay. So you can find it.
It's a newspaper.
Yeah, it's a newspaper. That's why.
Where Fritz Markov in the end of the 20th century, 30s.
Linkage must know something about it because he has been screening the newspapers of that time in German.
Okay. So maybe it's a short review because it's a newspaper. It's not very long.
It must be.
It's a newspaper.
No, in this newspaper there were also lengthy articles
okay.
by Haberl and Matlock, so it could be something.
Because at Duke we got crazy. I mean, me and the staff of the library, because there was nobody.
It's not a journal. It's really a daily newspaper.
Okay.
Linkage has screened all the newspaper articles of that time when he was in Vienna back in the 50s or 60s, and that was one of the stories he told us last.
That's right, yes.
Yes.
He was at the Summer Institute a year ago. He missed it. Sorry.
Sandy, it's your fault.
So that's a conspiracy.
This is a conspiracy. Yes, me.
Are there other questions?
Thank you so much.
Comments? Why don't we go ahead and take a break? Thanks very much. Why don't we reconvene at 2:45? That way we've got a nice long break and we'll just finish a little early.